The first thing Silas heard wasn't a voice but a conversation. A full, earnest, one-sided conversation drifting across the hilltop cemetery. He stopped, his boots quiet in the tall grass, and saw her. A little girl no more than 6 sitting cross-legged before a simple wooden cross, her small hand resting on it like she was holding someone's hand. And she was talking, telling her mama about her day, every day, because she had absolutely no one else left to tell. The man listening was Silas Creed, a drifter who thought he'd seen every kind of lonely the West had to offer. He was just passing through the high valley looking for temporary work, not for a child's private grief laid bare on a windswept hill. But in that moment, he was the only adult witness to a tragedy he didn't yet understand. A little girl, utterly alone, using a grave marker as her sole confidant. The question wasn't why she was talking to stone. It was why no living soul was left for her to talk to. And what a broken man, haunted by his own silence, could possibly do about it. Silas Creed had come to Three Pines Valley for the same reason he went anywhere. The work was temporary, and the people asked no questions. A week's pay for helping old man Peterson mend a miles-long stretch of split-rail fence that kept cattle from wandering into the high gulches. He slept in the barn loft, ate his meals alone, and spoke only when spoken to. A pattern worn smooth over 8 years of moving. The death of his own family, a fever that took his wife and infant son in the space of 5 brutal days back in '71, had turned him into a man who trusted the horizon more than he trusted people. Grief had a way of doing that, hollowing you out until the only safe thing was to keep the wind at your back. He first saw the girl 2 days before he heard her at the grave. She was in the general store with a man he'd learned was her uncle, Ephraim Hale. Ephraim was buying tobacco and a sack of flour, his voice a low, impatient rumble. The girl, who couldn't have been more than 6, stood perfectly still by the barrels of pickles and salt pork. She wore a faded blue-gray dress too thin for the mountain chill, and her auburn hair was a tangled mess. She didn't touch anything. She didn't speak. She just watched her uncle's back with the wary stillness of a rabbit sensing a hawk. When Ephraim turned and grunted, "Come on, Lily," she followed without a word, a shadow trailing a storm cloud. The storekeeper, a man named Higgins, let out a long sigh after they left and shook his head once, a silent commentary. Silas had seen that look before. It was the look people gave a problem they decided was not theirs to solve. The cemetery sat on a hill west of town, a patch of fenced ground dotted with maybe 30 markers, half of them simple wooden crosses bleached gray by sun and snow. Silas had taken a shortcut through it on his way back from the north pasture, his mind on the ache in his shoulders and the promise of a cold creek to wash off the dust. That's when the sound stopped him. Not crying, not singing, talking. A child's clear, earnest voice threading through the rustle of pine needles. "I found a blue jay feather today, Mama. It's the brightest blue. I put it in the tin on the windowsill with the others. Uncle Ephraim says feathers are dirty. He don't like the tin, but I keep it hid." Silas moved behind the thick trunk of a ponderosa pine, and he saw her, Lily, sitting cross-legged in the grass before a simple wooden cross. The name Eleanor Hale was carved into it, the date of death just over 4 months prior. The girl's small hand rested on the vertical beam as if it were a shoulder. Her posture was relaxed, engaged. This was not a fleeting visit. This was a routine. "Mrs. Jenkins at the post office gave me a peppermint. She asked if I had a nice Thanksgiving. I said yes. I didn't tell her we had beans. I said we had pie like you used to make. I think that was all right to say." She spoke for 10 minutes. She described her days in minute detail, the color of the sunrise, the grumpiness of the milk cow, a book she'd looked at in the schoolhouse window but couldn't read because she wasn't allowed to attend anymore. It was the outpouring of a mind and a heart with no other outlet. Every sentence was a silent scream of loneliness so profound it tightened Silas's chest. The research is clear. For a child, this maintaining of a bond, this continuing conversation, is a healthy coping mechanism. But it is meant to be a bridge, supported by living loved ones, not the entire structure of a child's emotional world. When she finished, she patted the cross twice, stood up, brushed off her dress, and walked back down the hill toward a dilapidated cabin at the tree line. Silas remained frozen long after she was gone, his own ghosts pressing in around him. He knew the shape of that loneliness. It was a house with too many empty rooms. At evening at the town's only saloon, he asked a careful question. The bartender, a man with a waxed mustache, was polishing glasses. "The Hale place." "Yeah, out by the West Ridge. Tragedy there last fall. Eleanor Hale, sweet woman, took a bad fall in the creek ravine, broke her neck, left the little girl, Lily." He leaned in, his voice dropping. "Brother Ephraim came from God knows where to run the place. Hard man, not much for farming or for children from what folks say, keeps to himself." "The girl?" "Well, she's quiet." "Does she go to school?" Silas asked. The bartender shrugged, avoiding his eyes. "Ephraim says she's needed at home. Folks don't like to meddle. It's a hard life out here. Everyone's got their own troubles." It was the universal excuse. Don't meddle. Silas had built his life on that principle. See something broken, keep riding. Your heart couldn't break over what you refused to hold. But the next afternoon, drawn by a pull he couldn't name, Silas found himself on the hill again. And there she was, same time, same cross, her voice a little brighter today. "I pretended today, Mama. I pretended you were just in the kitchen, and I was telling you about the feather while you rolled dough. It almost felt real." Something in Silas shattered. It was the word asterisk, pretended asterisk. This child was manufacturing a maternal presence from memory and hope because the real world had offered her nothing but neglect. The experts call it magical thinking, a normal part of grief for her age, but it was being forced to bear the full weight of her survival. He made a decision. It was foolish. It was dangerous. It went against every instinct of self-preservation he'd cultivated for 8 years. He wouldn't approach her. He wouldn't scare her. But he would be there. He would be a witness. He would, from a distance, ensure she made it to and from that grave safely every day. It was the smallest, most silent form of intervention he could conceive. For 3 days he did just that, watching from the tree line as she arrived, talked, and left. He learned her schedule. He saw the wear in her dress, the thinness of her arms. On the 4th day he saw something new, a dark, thumb-sized bruise on her forearm as she gestured while talking, a fresh, ugly bloom against her pale skin. The carefully constructed distance he'd built crumbled into dust. This was no longer just about loneliness. This was about safety. The cliffhanger came on a Friday with the sky threatening rain. Silas had finished his fence work. His pay was in his pocket. His horse was saddled. The road south was dry and open. Every fiber of his being told him to go, to leave Three Pines and its painful ghost of a girl behind. He stood at the edge of the cemetery, watching Lily place a few wildflowers at the base of the cross. She was crying today, soft, hiccuping sobs she tried to smother against her sleeve. "I'm trying to be good, Mama. I'm trying so hard, but I'm so lonesome." Silas took his hat off. He pressed it to his chest, just as he had the first time he'd heard her. The gesture of a man confronting something sacred and shattered. The decision solidified in his gut, heavy as stone. He would not ride out. He waited until she left, then he did not turn toward the south road. He turned and walked straight into the town of Three Pines, his boots hitting the boardwalk with a purpose they hadn't known in years. He went past the general store, past the saloon, to the small, weathered office at the end of the street. The shingle read, "Town Sheriff." He opened the door. Sheriff Colin Bryce, a man with a tired face and a star pinned to his vest, looked up from his desk. "Can I help you?" Bryce asked. Silas Creed stood in the doorway, the image of the little girl and her mother's grave burning behind his eyes. He spoke 4 words that would tear the quiet valley wide open. "I need to report a child." Sheriff Colin Bryce did not stand up. He did not reach for his hat. He leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking, and let the words hang in the quiet office. "Report a child," he repeated, his tone flat. "Which child would that be?" "Lily Hale," Silas said, closing the door behind him. "She's being neglected, possibly worse. She's alone up on that hill every day talking to her mother's grave because she has no one living to talk to. She's thin. She's got a bruise on her arm. She doesn't go to school. Bryce studied him for a long moment, his gaze taking in Silas's worn clothes, his traveler's dust. "You're the fella working for Peterson. Creed, is it?" "Silas Creed." "And how do you know so much about Lily Hale's daily habits, Mr. Creed?" The question was a trap and Silas walked straight into it. "I've seen her. In the cemetery, I've listened." "You've been watching a little girl in a cemetery," Bryce said, and now there was a weight to the words, a deliberate framing, day after day. Silas felt the first cold trickle of understanding. This wasn't going to be helped. This was going to be managed. "I wasn't watching her. I heard her. Any person with a conscience would have done the same. The child is in distress. Ephraim Hale is her legal guardian, her kin," Bryce said, as if reading from a manual. "He took her in after her mother's passing. That's a family matter. We don't have orphanages out here, Mr. Creed. Kin looks after kin. It's how it works." "Looking after her," Silas's voice tightened. "She's talking to a headstone for an hour a day because her uncle provides no comfort, no conversation, no care. That's not family. That's abandonment." Bryce finally stood, a slow, deliberate motion. He was a big man, gone soft in the middle but with shoulders that still spoke of strength. "I know Ephraim. He's a hard man, sure. Grieving himself, maybe. Not everyone shows it the same way, but I've had no complaints." "From who?" Silas shot back. "The child, she's 6. Who's she going to complain to, you?" The sheriff's face hardened. "My advice to you, since you're just passing through, is to finish your business with Mr. Peterson and move on. The Hale situation is complicated. Eleanor's death was hard on everyone. Ephraim stepped in when no one else would. That counts for something around here." "What's complicated about a hungry child?" Silas asked, but the fight was leaching out of him, replaced by a colder, clearer rage. He was looking at the system, the lone, overburdened, compromise-prone sheriff, and seeing its failure perfectly embodied. "I'll pay a visit," Bryce said, a clear placation. "I'll talk to Ephraim, check on the girl, that's all I can promise." It was nothing. A warning visit that would likely result in Lily bearing the brunt of her uncle's anger. Silas left the office without another word. The institutional path was closed. He stood on the boardwalk, the afternoon sun glaring off the dusty street, and felt the old urge rise. To saddle his horse and ride. To leave the complicated, painful problems of this valley to the people who lived here. But then he saw Higgins, the storekeeper, sweeping his porch. The man who had sighed. The man who had seen but not acted. Silas crossed the street. Higgins stopped sweeping, his expression guarded. "The little Hale girl," Silas said, dispensing with greeting. "Lily, how did her mother die?" Higgins glanced toward the sheriff's office, then back at Silas. "Told you, fell in the ravine, back in October." "How?" "How do you think? It's steep, rocks are loose. She was out looking for a strayed heifer, they said, slipped." Higgins's knuckles were white on the broom handle. "Tragedy." "They said," Silas repeated. "Who found her?" A longer pause. Higgins licked his lips. "Ephraim did, came running into town, shouting for help. Doc Wentworth went out, but it was too late." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a murmur. "Look, mister, Eleanor was a good woman, a kind woman. The whole town loved her. Her dying like that, it left a mark. And then Ephraim showing up so quick from Wyoming to take over, it was just ugly. Folks didn't know what to make of it, so they decided not to make anything of it." The pieces shifted, locking into a more sinister pattern. A brother arriving suspiciously quickly after a sudden death. A child isolated. A town choosing silence. This wasn't just neglect. It was a cover story, and everyone was too polite or too frightened to read past the first page. Silas's next stop was the doctor's house at the edge of town. Dr. Alastair Wentworth was an old man with gentle eyes and a tremor in his hands. He listened to Silas's questions from behind a cluttered desk, his face growing sadder with each one. "I signed the death certificate, Mr. Creed," Wentworth said quietly. Cause of death, traumatic injury to the spine from a fall. It was consistent with the scene. But, Silas pressed, hearing the hesitation. Wentworth sighed, a sound of profound weariness. But the body had other bruises, older ones, on her arms, her ribs. In places a fall like that wouldn't explain. She was fragile toward the end. Withdrawn, I asked her about them once. She said she was clumsy, that she'd taken a tumble in the barn. He looked out the window. I am a doctor. I am also a member of this small community. Sometimes the two roles are in conflict. Without proof, without an accusation from the victim, what was I to do? Start a war with a man like Ephraim Hale based on a feeling? The victim is dead, Silas said, his voice like gravel. And the accusation is a 6-year-old girl talking to a grave because she's too scared to talk to the living. The doctor flinched. What do you want from me? The truth, your professional opinion written down, that Alina Hale's injuries before her death were not consistent with simple clumsiness, that there were signs of possible duress. That could get me run out of this town, Wentworth whispered. Or it could save a child's life, Silas replied. He waited. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence. Finally, with a trembling hand, Dr. Wentworth pulled a piece of paper from his drawer. He began to write. Armed with the doctor's hesitant statement, Silas did not return to the sheriff. He knew now that Bryce was part of the silence. Instead, he went to the only other person he'd seen show Lily a flicker of kindness, Mrs. Agnes Jenkins at the post office. Agnes Jenkins was a widow in her 60s with a face like a kindly apple doll. She recognized Silas immediately. You're the one asking about Lily, she said, not as a question. She ushered him into the back of the post office, a small room smelling of paper and glue. I gave her a peppermint. It's a sin how that child is left to wander. But Ephraim Hale, he has a temper, and he owns the mortgage on more than one farm around here since Alina died. People are cautious. Did you know Alina? Silas asked. Tears sprang to the old woman's eyes. She was my friend, she was light itself, and she was terrified of her brother. He wrote to her for money for years. When he showed up last summer empty-handed, something in her closed-up shop. She told me once, Agnes, I don't know how to make him leave. I think she was trying to find a way to get her and Lily away. She started asking about stagecoach schedules to Denver. The story was crystallizing. A vulnerable woman, a predatory brother, a sudden, convenient accident, and a little girl who knew too much to be comforted but not enough to be believed. Silas spent the next 2 days gathering the fragile threads of testimony. He spoke to a rancher named Dobbs who'd heard shouting from the Hale cabin the night before Alina died. He found the schoolteacher, Miss Adams, who confirmed Lily had been abruptly pulled from school by Ephraim, who said, "Book learning ain't for girls." Each conversation was conducted in hushed tones, with fearful glances toward the door. Each person ended by saying, "But you didn't hear it from me." Silas was building a case, but it was a house of cards in a windy valley, and he was running out of time. His work for Peterson was done. His presence was becoming noticed. And twice, he saw Ephraim Hale in town, the man's dark, assessing gaze lingering on him from across the street. The confrontation came on a morning thick with fog. Silas was at the livery, settling his bill, when Ephraim Hale walked in. He was a raw-boned man with eyes the color of flint and a permanent sneer etched around his mouth. "You're the busybody talking to my neighbors," Ephraim said, dispensing with preamble. His voice was like two rocks grinding together. Silas turned slowly. "I'm a man asking questions about a little girl's welfare." "My niece's welfare is my business, not yours. You're a drifter, a nobody. You finish your business here today and you ride out by sundown." He took a step closer. The smell of cheap whiskey and unwashed wool rolled off him. "Or things might get complicated for you." It was a direct threat, and in that moment, Silas knew that leaving was no longer an option. If he rode out, Lily would vanish into a deeper darkness, and whatever had happened to Alina would be permanently buried under the weight of the town's silence. "I'm not leaving," Silas said, his voice low and even. Ephraim's sneer deepened. He leaned in. You think you're some kind of hero? She's my blood. The law says she's mine. That ends the discussion. The law hasn't seen the bruise on her arm, Silas said, or heard what the doctor has to say about her mother's older injuries. A flicker of something violent and unfiltered flashed in Ephraim's eyes. Surprise, then fury. The mask slipped. You stay away from my family. You stay away from my property, or you'll regret it deeply. He turned and stormed out, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. The liveryman stared at the ground, pretending he'd heard nothing. Silas knew what came next. The private threat would become public action. Ephraim would go to the sheriff, not to complain about Silas, but to frame him, to paint the concerned outsider as a dangerous interloper, a man who'd been lurking around a child. He was right. By that afternoon, Sheriff Bryce found him at the boarding house. His manner was no longer tired but stern, official. Ephraim Hale was just in my office, Mr. Creed. He's made a complaint. Says you've been trespassing on his land, harassing him, and showing an unnatural interest in his niece. He's demanding you be run out of the valley for the safety of his family. And you believe him, Silas said flatly. I believe I have a citizen's complaint, Bryce countered. And I have a stranger with no ties here causing trouble. My advice to move on is now in order. Be on the stage road out of here by first light tomorrow, or I'll arrest you for disturbing the peace and trespassing. It was a standoff. The law, such as it was, had been weaponized by the guilty party. Silas was out of official options, out of time, and out of allies. Or so he thought. As dusk settled, a soft knock came at his boarding house room door. When he opened it, Agnes Jenkins stood there, wrapped in a shawl, her face pale with determination. She thrust a small, folded piece of paper into his hand. I couldn't live with myself, she whispered. Alina gave this to me for safekeeping a week before she died. She said if anything happened to her, I should send it to her aunt in Sacramento. I was too scared. But you're not scared. She vanished into the twilight before Silas could respond. He closed the door and unfolded the paper. It was a letter in a graceful, looping handwriting. Dearest Aunt Clara asterisk. If you are reading this, then I am gone and my fears were justified. My brother Ephraim is not here to help. He is here to take. He has taken the money from the farm account. He speaks to me with cruelty and to little Lily with cold indifference. Last night he struck me for questioning him. I am afraid of what he will do. I am trying to be brave to plan our escape, but I feel his eyes on me always. Please, if this reaches you, find Lily. Protect her. She is all that is good in this world. Do not let him have her. I love you. Your Alina. It was a voice from the grave. A mother's final, desperate warning and plea. It was proof. Not of murder, but of malice, of threat, of a pattern of abuse that made a subsequent accident infinitely more likely. Silas Creed sat on the edge of his bed, the letter trembling in his hands. The sheriff had ordered him to leave. The town was closed against him. A dangerous man knew he was a threat. And he now held the one piece of evidence that could change everything. But presenting it to Sheriff Bryce would be futile. The man would call it a forgery, a fantasy. It would disappear. This letter needed a different kind of authority. It needed to bypass the compromised systems of Three Pines entirely. He knew then what he had to do. It was reckless. It would confirm every accusation Ephraim had made against him. It would make him an outlaw. He had to get Lily Hale out of that house, tonight. And he had to take her to the only place where her mother's letter would be heard. The territorial marshal's office in Silverton. 2 hard days, ride through mountain passes. The plan was born of desperation, not genius. Wait for full dark. Approach the cabin from the tree line, not the road. Hope the child was alone, and hope she trusted the sound of his voice more than her fear of her uncle. Silas left his horse, Smoke, tied deep in the pines a 1/4 mile away. He moved on foot, the moon a sliver behind scudding clouds, the only light a dull glow from the cabin's single window. He crouched in the brush, watching. He saw Ephraim's shadow pass the window, a bottle raised to his mouth. He heard the low mutter of a man talking to himself, but no small shadow, no child. His heart hammered against his ribs. What if she wasn't here? What if he'd already moved her, or worse? Then he saw her, a slight figure slipping out the back door, a bucket in hand, going to the well. It was his only chance. He moved like a ghost across the open yard, catching her just as she was hauling the heavy bucket up. She gasped, stumbling back, but he was on his knees in front of her before she could cry out. "Lily," he whispered, urgent. "My name is Silas. I'm a friend. I knew your mama." Her eyes, wide and terrified in the gloom, fixed on him. She didn't run. She didn't scream. She just stared. "I have a letter from her. She wrote it to keep you safe. Your uncle, he's not a safe man. I need to take you somewhere safe, right now." Her gaze flicked toward the cabin, then back to him. Her voice, when it came, was the barest breath. "He said strangers would lie. He said they'd try to take me." "I'm not lying," Silas said. He fumbled in his pocket, pulled out Alina's letter, and held it out. He couldn't expect her to read it in the dark, but the paper itself, the shape of it, seemed to mean something. She reached out one small, cold hand and touched the edge. "Mama's paper," she whispered. "It smells like her." That was all the trust he was going to get. "We have to go now. Can you be very quiet?" She nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. The bucket was forgotten. She put her hand in his. They were 20 yards into the tree line when the cabin door banged open. "Lily!" Ephraim's roar split the night. "Where'd you get to, girl?" Silas froze, pulling Lily down behind a fallen log. He felt her whole body trembling. They listened to the heavy, stumbling footsteps circle the yard, the cursing. A lantern was lit, casting a wobbly yellow light. Then the footsteps stopped. Silas knew what he'd found, the abandoned bucket by the well. The next sound was not a shout, but a chilling, focused curse. Then the lantern light began moving toward the tree line. "Run," Silas breathed. He scooped Lily into his arms and ran. Not toward where smoke was tied, that was the expected path. He cut east uphill, toward a jumble of boulders he'd scouted earlier. He heard Ephraim crashing through the brush behind them, but the man was drunk and angry, his movements clumsy. Silas, with the child in his arms, was fueled by pure adrenaline. He reached the rocks, set Lily down, and pressed a finger to his lips. They huddled in a crevice, listening as the lantern light and the cursing passed by, moving westward toward the main trail. They waited until the sounds faded completely. Then, in a wide arc, Silas led Lily back to smoke. He mounted first, then pulled her up in front of him, wrapping his coat around her. She was shivering violently, but she didn't cry. "Hold on," he said, and they rode into the blackness of the mountain night. The first day was a tense, silent flight. Silas avoided all known trails, picking his way through dense timber and across rocky streams to leave no clear track. Lily spoke only once around noon when he offered her a piece of jerky. "Is he coming?" "Yes," Silas said, "because lying would break the fragile trust. But we have a head start, and I know these mountains." She nodded, chewing the tough meat with a solemnity that broke his heart. She was too young for this kind of calculus. Head starts, pursuit, survival. Yet she was doing it. That night, huddled under a lean-to of pine boughs with a small, smokeless fire, she finally spoke unprompted. "I told Mama about you." Silas paused in stirring a tin of beans. "You did?" "Last time I saw you in the trees, I told her a man with a sad face was listening. I asked her if he was an angel she sent." Lily looked into the flames. She didn't answer, but I thought maybe. The innocence of it, the desperate need to believe in benevolent intervention, was a weight on Silas's soul. "I'm no angel, Lily. I'm just a man who forgot how to care about things for a while. Your mama helped me remember." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Uncle Ephraim pushed her." The words dropped into the night air like stones into a still pond. Silas went very still. "What did you say?" Lily's eyes were huge and dark, reflecting the fire. He was yelling about money. Mama said there wasn't any more. He called her a liar. He grabbed her arm. She pulled away and she fell backwards, down into the ravine. A single tear traced a clean path through the dirt on her cheek. I was hiding behind the woodpile. He didn't see me. After he looked down and he said, "Stupid, clumsy woman." Then he climbed down. When he came back up, he was carrying her. He was crying, but not sad crying, mad crying. The revelation was worse than Silas had imagined. It wasn't a premeditated murder. It was a fit of rage and accidental killing. But the cover-up, the isolation of the witness, that was calculated. Ephraim knew exactly what Lily had seen. "You never told anyone?" Silas asked softly. She shook her head. "He said if I ever told, he'd send me away to a horrible place, or I'd fall down the ravine too, and then I wouldn't be able to talk to Mama anymore." She looked at him, her lower lip trembling. "Is that true? If I told, would I have stopped being able to hear her?" The psychological manipulation was devastating. He had weaponized her grief, her one coping mechanism, to ensure her silence. "No, sweetheart," Silas said, his voice thick. "You can always talk to her, and she can always hear you. Telling the truth doesn't change that. It never could." She leaned against him then, a small, exhausted weight. He put his arm around her, and they sat that way until she fell asleep. The second day, the weather turned. A cold, sleety rain began to fall, turning the game trails to slick mud. Smoke slipped and stumbled, and progress slowed to a crawl. Silas knew they were losing their lead. He also knew Ephraim wouldn't be alone. He'd have gone to Sheriff Bryce, spinning a tale of kidnapping. The law would now be on the pursuer's side, not the rescuer. His fears were confirmed mid-afternoon. From a high ridge, he saw a column of 6 riders on the valley floor below, following a path that would eventually intersect with theirs. Even at a distance, he recognized Bryce's bulky shape and Ephraim's furious, gesturing form. They had a tracker with them, a lean man on a paint horse who was reading the ground even in the rain. They were hunted. Silas changed direction, pushing Smoke into a steep, treacherous climb toward a high pass that was likely already choked with early snow. It was a risk. If they got bogged down, they were trapped. But it was the only route the posse might hesitate to follow. The temperature dropped as they climbed. The sleet turned to wet, heavy snow. Lily, wrapped in Silas's coat and a blanket, was silent and wide-eyed. He could feel her fear, a constant vibration against his chest. They were within a half-mile of the pass crest when the shot rang out. A single, sharp crack that echoed off the granite walls. The bullet whined off a rock 10 feet to their left. Silas whipped his head around. Below and behind, on a switchback they'd traversed an hour before, stood Ephraim Hale. He had dismounted and was holding a rifle, already levering another round. He'd broken from the posse, taken a riskier, steeper route to cut them off. Madness and rage had made him bold. "Hold on," Silas yelled, and he kicked Smoke into a lunging gallop. The trail here was narrow, a ribbon of dirt and rock with a sheer drop on one side. Another shot. Closer. Smoke shied, his hooves scrabbling at the edge. For a heart-stopping second, Silas felt the horse's balance go. He hauled on the reins with all his strength, leaning hard into the mountain. Smoke recovered, snorting in terror, and surged forward. They rounded a bend, and the pass opening lay before them, a narrow, snow-filled gap between 2 peaks. It was their only way through. And it was blocked. A recent avalanche, triggered by the wet snow, had deposited a tangled wall of broken trees, rock, and dense snow across the entire width of the pass. It was 20 feet high and impassable. Silas reined in, despair a cold knot in his gut. They were cornered. The narrow trail behind them, the wall in front. Ephraim would be on them in minutes. He looked down at Lily. Her face was pale, but her jaw was set. She pointed. There. At the base of the avalanche debris, partially hidden by a jutting boulder, was a dark opening. A cave, or a crevasse. It was their only chance. He slid from the saddle, pulling Lily down. He led Smoke toward the opening, but the horse balked, eyes rolling white. The space was too small. He was a liability now. With a wrench in his heart, Silas pulled his rifle from the scabbard, slung his pack, and slapped Smoke hard on the rump. "Go home." The startled horse spun and bolted back down the trail the way they'd come, maybe to confuse the pursuers, maybe to find his own safety. Then, with Lily's hand in his, Silas ducked into the black mouth of the cave. It was not a cave. It was a mine shaft, an old, abandoned prospector's tunnel driven into the mountain who knew how long ago. The air was stale and cold. They stumbled forward into the pitch darkness, Silas feeling his way along the rough-hewn wall. The sound of their breathing was loud in the enclosed space. Behind them at the entrance, they heard Ephraim's voice, ragged with exertion. "I know you're in there. There's nowhere to run." A beam of lantern light pierced the darkness, probing the tunnel. Silas pulled Lily around a bend in the shaft, out of the direct light. He pressed her against the wall, his body shielding hers, and raised his rifle. He didn't have to shoot. They heard a scuffle, a shout. Sheriff Bryce's voice booming. "Hale, stand down, put the rifle down now. They're in there, he's got my girl. We'll get them, but we do this by the book. You firing that weapon near a child, have you lost your mind?" The argument at the tunnel entrance was heated. Silas listened, his mind racing. Bryce sounded angry but in control. He was reining Ephraim in. But why? To take Lily back legally, to arrest Silas. Either way, they were trapped. Then he heard another voice, older, calmer, Dr. Wentworth. "Colum, we need to be careful. If the child is in there, she's terrified. We need to talk them out, not shoot them out." The doctor had come. That was something, a voice of reason. Silas made a decision. He couldn't win a shootout, not with Lily in the crossfire. And maybe, just maybe, Bryce's presence meant the rule of law hadn't completely abandoned them. He leaned down to Lily's ear. "I'm going to talk to them. I need you to stay right here. Don't come out until I call for you, no matter what you hear. Do you understand?" She clutched his sleeve, her eyes huge in the faint light from the entrance. "Don't go." "I have to, it's the only way." He squeezed her hand. "I'll be right back, I promise." He walked toward the light, his hands raised, his rifle held loosely in one hand, pointed at the ground. He emerged from the tunnel mouth into a circle of armed men. Sheriff Bryce, two deputies, Dr. Wentworth, and Ephraim, who was being physically restrained by one of the deputies. Ephraim's face was a mask of pure hatred. Bryce leveled his pistol at Silas. "Drop the rifle, Creed, it's over." Silas slowly knelt and set the rifle on the ground. "The girl is safe. She's in the tunnel. She's unharmed." "You kidnapped her," Ephraim screamed, struggling against the deputy's hold. "I removed her from a dangerous situation," Silas said, his eyes on Bryce. "I have evidence, Sheriff. A letter from Alina Hale, written days before her death, stating she was in fear for her life from her brother. And the child herself is a witness. She saw what happened at the ravine." Bryce's face was unreadable. "You should have brought this evidence to me." "I tried. You told me to leave." A flicker of discomfort crossed the sheriff's features. He glanced at Dr. Wentworth, who gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Where's the letter?" Bryce asked. "In my coat. May I reach for it?" Bryce nodded. Silas slowly pulled out the folded paper and handed it to the sheriff. Bryce scanned it, his lips pressed into a thin line. He handed it to Dr. Wentworth. "That her handwriting, Doc?" Wentworth read it, his hands trembling. "Yes, that's Alina's hand, without a doubt." The atmosphere shifted. The deputies looked at Ephraim, their grips tightening. Ephraim saw the change. His bluster faded, replaced by a wild, cornered fear. "She's lying," the girl's confused. "That drifter put ideas in her head." "There's one way to find out," Bryce said, his voice heavy. He looked at Silas. "Get the girl." Silas turned and called into the darkness. "Lily, it's safe. Come out now." For a long moment, nothing. Then small, hesitant footsteps. Lily appeared at the tunnel mouth, squinting in the light. She saw the crowd of men, saw her uncle, and froze. Dr. Wentworth stepped forward, his voice gentle. "Lily, honey, it's Dr. Alastair, you remember me. No one is going to hurt you. The sheriff just needs to ask you a few questions. Can you do that?" Lily's eyes found Sela's. He nodded. She took a tentative step forward, then another, until she was standing beside him, her hand finding his. Bryce knelt down, bringing himself to her level. "Lily, I need you to tell me the truth. Can you do that?" She nodded, a tiny movement. "What happened to your mama?" Ephraim made a strangled sound, but a deputy silenced him with a sharp jerk. Lily looked at her uncle, then at the kind face of the doctor, then up at Sela's. She took a deep, shuddering breath, and she told them. The same story she told Sela's by the fire. The yelling, the grab, the fall, hiding behind the woodpile, the mad crying. When she finished, the only sound was the sigh of the wind through the pass. Bryce stood up slowly. He looked at Ephraim Hale, and for the first time there was no weariness in his eyes. There was cold, clear purpose. "Ephraim Hale," he said, "you're under arrest for the unlawful death of Alina Hale and for the endangerment and intimidation of a child." He nodded to his deputies. "Take him." As the deputies clamped irons on Ephraim's wrists, the man's defiance crumbled. He didn't fight. He just stared at Lily with a look of such bewildered betrayal that it was clear he never believed she'd have the courage to speak. Bryce turned to Sela's. "As for you, Creed, technically you're under arrest for kidnapping and interfering with a legal guardian, but given the circumstances," he rubbed his forehead, "the territorial marshal in Silverton is going to have to sort this out. You'll both come with me. The child goes into the temporary care of Dr. Wentworth and his wife until the court decides." It was not a victory. It was a reprieve. The law was a slow, grinding machine, and Lily was now a piece of evidence within it. Sela's would likely face charges, but Ephraim was in chains, and Lily was, for the moment, safe. As they made the long, cold ride back to Three Pines, Lily riding before Dr. Wentworth on his gentle mare, Sela's riding with his hands loosely bound, he realized the fight had only changed shape. They had survived the mountain, the pursuit, the confrontation. But now they faced the courtroom, the whispers of the town, and the uncertain future of a child caught in the gears of justice. The rescue was over. The battle for her future was about to begin. The jail in Three Pines was a single, dank cell at the back of the sheriff's office, and it was there that Sela's Creed waited for 7 days. He was not mistreated. Sheriff Bryce, perhaps burdened by his earlier inaction, saw that he got decent food and coffee. But the walls were stone, the air was cold, and the uncertainty was a heavier lock than the iron on the door. The charge was kidnapping, a felony that could see him spend years in a territorial prison. His fate and Lily now rested in the hands of a circuit judge and a territorial marshal who had not yet arrived. Lily was placed in the temporary care of Dr. Wentworth and his wife, Martha. They were kind, childless people who lived in a white clapboard house with a picket fence and a garden. It was the picture of stability. Agnes Jenkins brought over a small suitcase of clothes she'd secretly sewn for Lily over the winter, having guessed the child's needs long before the town admitted them. For the first time in months, Lily slept in a clean bed, ate regular meals, and was spoken to with tenderness. But she was not at peace. Dr. Wentworth reported to Sela's through the cell bars that she had nightmares. She was quiet, watchful, and every afternoon, like clockwork, she would ask if she could visit the cemetery. Martha Wentworth always accompanied her, standing a respectful distance away as Lily sat by her mother's cross. But now, the doctor told Sela's, the conversations were different, shorter, less about the details of her day and more about him. "She tells Alina about you," Wentworth said, his voice low. "She says, 'Mama, the sad-faced man is in a cage because of me. I told the truth like you said to. Was that wrong?'" The words carved a hollow in Sela's chest. The child was carrying guilt for his imprisonment. The very act meant to free her had become another chain. The legal machinery began to turn. Ephraim Hale, held in a separate cell, was sullen and silent, refusing a lawyer. The evidence against him was compelling but circumstantial. Elinor's letter, Lily's testimony, the doctor's observations of old bruises. In the eyes of a court, it was the word of a grief-stricken 6-year-old against her only living blood relative. The outcome was far from certain. The turning point came on the 8th day with the arrival of 2 men. The first was Marshal John C. Harlow from Silverton, a wiry man with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor who'd been briefed by telegram. The second was a surprise to everyone, a lawyer named Arthur Finch who traveled from Denver. He did not represent Ephraim. He approached Silas's cell, introduced himself, and said, "I've been retained on your behalf, Mr. Creed." And the child? "By who?" Silas asked, baffled. "By a benefactor who wishes to remain anonymous for now," Finch said, opening a leather case. "My job is to ensure this situation is resolved in the best interest of Lily Hale and to keep you, her apparent champion, from being railroaded by an overzealous application of the law." The anonymous benefactor could only be Agnes Jenkins, who must have sold something precious, or Dr. Wentworth, leveraging old contacts. It didn't matter. For the first time, Silas had an ally who understood the law. Marshal Harlow convened an informal hearing right there in the sheriff's office. Not a full trial, but a fact-finding session to decide on immediate custody and charges. Present were the marshal, Sheriff Bryce, Finch, Silas, Ephraim, Dr. Wentworth, and for a brief, terrifying interval, Lily herself. The marshal listened to everything. He read Elinor's letter. He heard Dr. Wentworth's testimony about the bruises. He listened as Sheriff Bryce, with evident discomfort, explained his initial reluctance to intervene. Then he turned to Ephraim. "What is your response to these allegations, Mr. Hale?" Ephraim, his arrogance replaced by a caged desperation, blurted out, "She fell. It was an accident. The girl's confused. She's always been a dreamy thing, talking to that grave like her mother's still there. And that drifter put notions in her head." The marshal's eyes shifted to Lily, who sat very still on a chair next to Dr. Wentworth, clutching a handkerchief. "Lily," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle, "no one is angry with you. Can you tell me one more time what you saw happen to your mama?" Lily looked at Silas. He gave her the smallest nod. She looked at her uncle, who glared back, and she flinched. But then she looked down at the handkerchief, her small fingers twisting it. She didn't speak for a long moment. Then, in a clear, quiet voice that held no hint of a dreamy child, she said, "He didn't mean to make her fall, but he meant to be mean. He was always mean. He grabbed her and she slipped. And after, he was scared. But he was also glad." She finally looked up at the marshal, her eyes dry and ancient. He was glad she wasn't there to say no to him anymore. It was the distinction between manslaughter and murder, but it was also the unvarnished truth of a child who understood the heart of a man better than any adult. The room was utterly silent. Ephraim sagged in his chair, all fight gone. The truth, once spoken aloud in this official setting, had a finality to it. Marshal Harlow made his decision swiftly. Ephraim Hale would be transported to Silverton to stand trial for manslaughter and child endangerment. Given the circumstances and the lack of premeditation, a prison sentence was likely, but not a hanging. Then he turned to the matter of Lily. The child has no immediate kin. The nearest relation appears to be an elderly aunt in Sacramento, mentioned in the letter. He looked at Dr. Wentworth. "Your home is a suitable temporary refuge, doctor, but permanency is required." Arthur Finch cleared his throat. "If it pleases the marshal, we would petition for guardianship to be granted to Mr. Silas Creed." Bryce stirred. "He's a drifter with no fixed address, no means beyond day labor. He's facing kidnapping charges." "Which," Finch interjected smoothly, "were the direct result of him acting in loco parentis to prevent imminent harm to the child, after local authorities failed to act. We have signed statements from the doctor, the postmistress, and the schoolteacher detailing their concerns and the community's failure to intervene. We will argue necessity. As for his circumstances, Mr. Creed is a capable man. My client is prepared to offer him permanent employment as the foreman of a newly acquired property here in Three Pines Valley, the former Hale Farm, which will be held in trust for Lily until she comes of age. It was the surprise. The anonymous benefactor hadn't just hired a lawyer, they had bought the farm. Silas could only stare. The Hale Farm, free of Ephraim's shadow, could be a home, a real one. Marshal Harlow raised an eyebrow. And who is this generous client? Finch allowed a small smile. A former patron of Alina Hale's from her younger days in Denver, who wishes their identity shielded to avoid scandal, but whose conscience and resources have been stirred by this tragedy. The papers are in order. The marshal leaned back, stroking his chin. He looked at Silas. Mr. Creed, this is highly unorthodox. You are a stranger to this child. What is your interest? Silas stood. He hadn't planned to speak. The words came slowly, forged in the quiet of his cell and the memory of a child voice on a hill. I'm not a stranger anymore. I'm the person who listened when she thought no one was. I'm the person who believed her. She shouldn't have to earn a family. She should just have one. I can't replace her mother, but I can make sure the person she talks to at the end of the day is living and listening and loves her. That's my interest. The marshal held his gaze for a long moment, then looked at Lily. And what is your interest, young lady? Who would you choose to live with? All eyes turned to her. She slid off her chair and walked across the room, not to the marshal but to Silas. She stopped in front of him and reached her hand through the cell bars. He took it. She looked back at Marshal Harlow and said one word, him. 2 days later, the kidnapping charges against Silas Creed were dropped, citing justifiable cause and the failure of local protection. The paperwork for guardianship was filed, pending a final review by a family court judge in 6 months. Ephraim was taken to Silverton in a prison wagon, and Silas walked out of the sheriff's office a free man, his hand holding Lily's. They did not go to the Wentworth house. They went to the hill. The late afternoon sun was golden, the wildflowers nodding in a soft breeze. Lily knelt by her mother's cross, placing a fresh bunch of blue lupin she'd picked at the meadow's edge. Silas stood a few paces back, his hat in his hands, just as he had that first day. Lily was quiet for a minute, then she began to speak. Mama, this is Silas. He's going to stay. We're going to live in our house again. He fixed the hinge on the kitchen door so it doesn't scream. He says I can have a kitten from Mrs. Jenkins's barn cat's next litter. She reached out and touched the wood. I don't have to tell you everything about my day anymore, but I want to. Is that okay? In the silence that followed, a gust of wind swept up the hill, rustling the grass and the leaves of the aspen trees. It sounded like a sigh, like an answer. Lily stood up, brushed off her knees, and walked back to Silas. She slipped her hand into his. She says it's okay. They turned and walked down the hill together, toward the farmhouse that was no longer a place of fear, but a project, a future. The work was immense. The farm was run down, the fields neglected. But for the first time in 8 years, Silas Creed wasn't looking at a horizon he needed to reach. He was looking at a home he needed to build. The final surprise came 3 weeks later, in the form of a letter addressed to Silas, care of the Three Pines post office. It was from the lawyer, Arthur Finch. Mr. Creed, asterisk. Per my client's instructions, I am now at liberty to reveal their identity. Your benefactor is Mrs. Clara Vance of Denver. She was Alina Hale's employer and dear friend for many years before Alina returned to Three Pines to run the family farm after her parents' death. Mrs. Vance had long been concerned about Ephraim's influence. She received Alina's frightened letter, sent by Agnes Jenkins after all, but by the time she acted, the tragedy had occurred. Her resources have secured the property and my services. Her one condition is that you allow Lily to correspond with her so she may know the girl thrives. She believes Alina would have approved of you, as do I, asterisk. Yours sincerely, Arthur Finch. It was the last piece of the puzzle. The mysterious guardian angel had a face, and a connection to a leaner. It meant Lily still had a link to her mother's world, a wealthy, caring presence in the wings. It meant Silas wasn't entirely alone in this either. Life found its rhythm. Silas worked the farm, slowly bringing it back to life. Lily helped where she could, feeding chickens, tending a small vegetable patch. She started school again, walking with the other children each morning, a solemn but now integrated member of the community. The people of Three Pines, chastened by events, extended a cautious but genuine welcome. The town had been complicit in its silence, but in its own slow way it sought to make amends. And every afternoon, weather permitting, they would walk up the hill. Sometimes Lily would chat with her mother. Sometimes she would just sit, and Silas would sit beside her, both of them looking out over the valley. The conversations with the grave became less a lifeline and more a tradition, a healthy continuation of a bond, supported now by the solid, living presence of family. One evening, sitting on the porch as fireflies sparked in the twilight, Lily looked up from the reader she was slowly sounding out. Silas. Yes, Lily. Are you my father now? The question hung in the sweet, dark air. He thought of his own son, who never had the chance to ask a question. He thought of the empty years of riding. He looked at this fierce, fragile, resilient girl who had trusted him with her truth and her life. No, he said honestly, I'm not your father. I'm the man who gets to stand in his place, and that's the greatest honor I've ever been given. She considered this, then nodded, seemingly satisfied with the precision of the answer. She went back to her book. Silas Creed, the drifter, looked out at the land that was now his responsibility, at the child who was now his heart, and he felt the old, hollowed-out places inside him finally begin to fill. Not with forgetting, but with something new, with purpose, with love. The story that began with a lonely conversation at a grave ended not with an ending, but with a beginning. A family had been redefined, not by blood, but by choice, by courage, and by the simple, transformative act of listening. What Silas Creed found on that wind-blown hill was more than a child's secret. It was a reflection of a universal truth we too often ignore. Grief, especially a child's grief, is not a quiet, private thing. It is a conversation that demands a listener. For months, Lily's only listener was a piece of carved wood, because every living person in her world had, in some way, chosen not to hear her. They saw a problem, sighed, and looked away. What transforms a tragedy into a story of hope is not the absence of bystanders, but the presence of one person who decides that looking away is no longer an option. The experts call it continuing bonds, the healthy human need to maintain a relationship with those we've lost. Lily's daily visits were a textbook example of this coping mechanism. But psychology also tells us that for a child to navigate such a loss successfully, one thing is paramount: the availability of at least one significant, supportive adult. For too long, Lily had none. Silas, a man who believed he had nothing left to give, became that adult. In saving her, he saved himself from a life defined only by what he had lost. This story redefines family not by genealogy but by grace. It asks a difficult question. In our own communities, in our own circles, who is talking to a headstone because they believe no living soul will listen? And are we, in our busyness, our discomfort, or our fear of overstepping, playing the part of the townsfolk who sigh and sweep their porches, telling ourselves it's not our place to intervene? The legacy of Alina Hale is not just in the letter she left, but in the chain of courage it inspired. A postmistress who finally handed it over, a doctor who wrote his doubts down, a lawyer who traveled from Denver, a benefactor in the city who used her resources to secure a future, and a broken cowboy who remembered how to care. It proves that isolation is a lie. We are all connected, and often the most profound family is the one we build from the shattered pieces left behind. Silas and Lily's story doesn't end with happily ever after, because life on a farm is hard and grief has echoes, but it continues with something better, together. He found a purpose to root him to the earth. She found a protector who allowed her to be a child again. They are a family, chosen and cherished, a living answer to a mother's final, whispered prayer from a grave on a hill. If this story of quiet courage and unexpected family resonated with you, hit that subscribe button. It tells the algorithm you want more real human stories like this one. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever witnessed or experienced a moment where an outsider's kindness rewrote someone's story? I read every one. Thanks for listening.